You are listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 13th of December 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Broadcasting from Midori House in London, this is The Globalist, and I'm Chris Cermak. Coming up, Syria considers its future under an interim government and prime minister. We'll ask just how inclusive that new government's approach will be for all Syrians. From there to the Vatican, which is embroiled in a diplomatic spat over whether Jesus was Palestinian or Jewish. We'll also have a look through the newspapers and then...
We learned that in the English settlement of Winchester, teeth were being gnashed at a winter wonderland-style attraction with particular reference to a suboptimal Santa Claus.
Andrew Muller tells us what we learned this week. We find out how the European Central Bank plans to revive growth in Europe. And finally, we hear from the creators of the Czech Republic's Oscar nomination for Best International Film.
Bojujeme za svobodu slova. Jako vy.
That's all up ahead on The Globalist, live from London. This is The Globalist, and we will begin with Syria. It has been less than a week since Assad's regime was sent fleeing in a shockingly quick offensive by rebels led by HTS. And while there's still much that we don't know, a few things are starting to become clear. There is an interim government with a caretaker prime minister in Mohammed al-Bashir, who at least in theory will usher in an inclusive process with all Syrians to figure out exactly what kind of government and constitution the country would want to see more permanently. That is the theory. To find out how this all works in practice, I'm joined now by the geopolitical and Middle East expert, Hafed al-Ghwell, Senior Fellow at SAIS Foreign Policy Institute, Johns Hopkins University, and also a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Center of Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. Hafed, great to have you on the show. First of all, what do you make, I suppose, of the transition so far? Has it been smoother than expected in 5 days?
Thank you, Chris, very much. I'm really happy to be with you. Yes, so far I'm watching it very carefully, and they seem to be doing the right things. They're making the right decisions. They maintain the formal government at least until they announce a new prime minister and transitional government. That's a good sign. They did not come in, guns blazing and destroying or dismantling and everything. They seem to have a good control so far on the spread of arms around the various militias. They've been talking a good game when it comes to transition, what they plan to do, how inclusive they want to be. The most important and critical thing in these days is usually also on the side of revenge, where populations have a tendency to exaggerate their revenge and violence. That seems to be under control so far. So all of the signs are there for a good, peaceful, rational transition, quite different from what we've seen in Iraq and Libya, where it was free for all kind of chaos with vengeance, with entering into public and private properties, taking over even neighborhoods with arms. So far, so good. I hope they maintain that.
Well, you do bring up, of course, the two other examples that people think of in this process when it comes to Iraq and Libya. And I did want to ask you a bit more about that in terms of why you think this government might be more stable. Is there a prospect that Syria can have a more centralized government that does manage to control all the different either rebel groups, warlords, anything else around the country that might want to set up their own havens around the country? Why might this government be able to control that better?
That's a very, very good question. I would assume the fact that they have been at it for 14 years. I mean, don't forget that the Syrian revolution started in 2011 with the Arab Spring and has been going through ups and downs, but it maintained its present. I think they've learned a lot during that time. They also seem to have learned lessons from Iraq and Libya. They've been watching these two places. They seem to know what not to do, at least. I'm not sure they still know what they want to do, but at least what not to do is good. There is the third and final element is that I think the international community itself has learned a great deal from what happened in both Iraq and Syria and Libya, that turned into tragedies right after, all kinds of hope and prospects. So I'm hoping all of these things are gonna contribute to a much more rational, calm transition in Syria. There is also a number of countries that have a stake in this, that I think they need a peaceful transition as much as possible. You have, of course, Turkey, you have Russia, you have Israel's interest. All of these elements, I think they all now recognize that they'd rather have a peaceful transition and a unified government that they can all deal with and do business with than just a fragmentation of the country and chaos all over the place.
Well, and Hafed, you say that the rebels led by HTS now in government, I mean, they have been at this for a while, as you say, but that was in a part of the country. And that does bring us, I suppose, to the question of going forward. If they do want to assert control over the entire country, how important is it that this process is inclusive, that it includes other groups that perhaps had not been part of this opposition until now? And how do they go about doing that?
Absolutely, it's a great observation. Yes, they've been in a part of the country, but they seem to be trying to duplicate that success they've had, even by naming the same prime minister who was in charge of that part of the country. So they are trying to scale up, if you will, their experience to cover the whole country. So that's one. Secondly, Syria is a very difficult country in a sense that it is extremely diverse. It has minorities of all kinds, of religious backgrounds. I think anybody with any sense of Syria will immediately recognize that you have to include everybody if you would like to be a national government. You cannot alienate Christians, you cannot alienate other Muslim sects, you cannot alienate anybody, and therefore you need to include them and engage them in the future. The trick here, and what we've learned from Libya, is to get everybody on board for the future. You need to give a stake for everybody to contribute to the future and not start turning back into the past and extracting revenge and so on, which will lead into fragmentation and division. I think now the question is, how are they going to deal with the past? And I think they should have learned from both Libya and Iraq that they need to pass on an amnesty of some sort. That does not deny individuals, of course, of claiming their rights through the courts. But I think the transition has to be done legally within the framework of the judiciary rather than outside of it. I think they need to also, so far, their government seems to be from one sort of side of Syria. I think they need to expand it. They need to create a diverse government that includes also Christians and other minorities in the mix. So they are really facing a very difficult period ahead, and nobody. I mean, despite all the intentions, the question is, I'm sure their intentions are good. I'm sure their intentions is to unify the country and move forward. But the question is, sometimes things don't work exactly as they want, especially when you have outsiders that might spoil the process, which is what we've seen especially in Libya. You had some countries who seen or have viewed any democratic transition as a threat to their own rule. I mean, the UAE comes to mind, which sort of always felt that any democratic change in any of the Arab countries can undermine its own authority at home. And so they've been working very hard, especially in Libya, for example, over the years, to make it a very difficult environment, and to even encourage some war. And they've even committed all kinds of acts of violence against the Libyans in various parts with their own drones and military presence, because they want people at home to say, oh, look what happens when you do a revolution asking for freedom and democracy. It goes to chaos, everybody loses. So there are some countries we cannot discount that they have a stake in the failure of the process. How Syrians and the international community is able to deal with that is going to be a very big challenge.
Hafed, thank you very much for joining us. That was the Middle East expert, Hafed al-Ghwell there. This is The Globalist. Now, you are back with The Globalist. The Christmas holidays are a time where the Vatican inevitably takes center stage for many of the world's Catholics, but this year's efforts by Pope Francis to broaden the Vatican's remit in the run-up to the holidays have faced no small amount of diplomatic intrigue. A nativity display of the baby Jesus lying on a keffiyeh, symbol of Palestinian culture and nationalism, was promptly removed after complaints by Jewish groups that it suggested the Vatican backs the idea that Jesus himself was Palestinian. The controversy comes as Pope Francis was also meeting with the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, at the Vatican. Well, joining me now to discuss both of these elements is Juliet Linley, journalist and former Vatican correspondent, joins us from our Zurich headquarters. Juliet, good morning.
Good morning, Chris. Hello from Zurich.
Juliet, tell us first of all about this nativity display controversy. What do we know about it? How did this start?
Chris, let me first clarify that every Christmas, by tradition, two key symbols are donated to be put on display in St. Peter's Square at Christmas. The first is a giant fir tree from a different region or a different country every year. And the second is a nativity scene, often life-sized, also made by different artisans from different parts of Italy. Now, the contested nativity scene, which is called Nativity of Bethlehem 2024, is not to be mistaken for the main one that is still there in St. Peter's Square and has not been removed. So the one in question is a small nativity set. It was installed indoors in the Vatican's Aula Paolo VI, which, as many pilgrims would know, is the large audience hall used when the Pope meets large groups of pilgrims or when the weather is too bad for his usual Wednesday Angelus on Wednesday mornings outside in St. Peter's Square, where he meets and greets visitors and pilgrims. So this creche was designed by artists from Bethlehem. It was a donation organized by the Palestinian Embassy to the Holy See, to the Vatican, as well as by an entity linked to the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and several other local organizations. So that's just to clarify which nativity scene we're talking about.
It is a fair point. It is not the main nativity scene, but nevertheless, when it comes to this, do we get a sense then, I suppose, of how much the Vatican will have known about this, how much they will have been aware, or is this something that they were perhaps unaware of the donation and then removed it once complaints started coming in?
The Vatican was very aware. It was unveiled on Saturday, and Vatican media put out a photo of Pope Francis praying in front of the display, in front of the nativity scene. You see him clearly sitting in his wheelchair. It's a shot from behind where you can see baby Jesus lying on this keffiyeh. Now, as the Palestine Chronicle put it, the keffiyeh is a clear nod to the Palestinian struggle, if you want. It's such a clear symbol of national pride for Palestinians. Palestinians, and so on. So immediately after the inauguration of this creche, the Jewish group B'nai Brit International said that they felt disturbed by it, saying that it's not just a politicization, but revisionism. They said that it presents Palestinians as innocent victims and Jesus as a Palestinian, not a Jew. Now, Jesus' parents were Jewish, so if we're looking at newborn baby Jesus, so was he. They were, of course, in the land of Palestine at the time, during biblical times. So maybe, as one person online said, let's just technically call him a Palestinian Jew and keep everyone happy. However, that said, yesterday the Vatican removed the creche. They haven't given a statement as to why it was removed. They haven't responded to journalists' requests for that information. But that's how serious this becomes. And, you know, this is such a hot button issue. The Middle East, religion, politics. So it's perhaps not surprising that this is the outcome, Chris.
Well, it's perhaps not surprising, but then the way you suggest the fact that the Vatican has also not necessarily commented on its removal now, I mean, is this just a sign that the Vatican does actually want to stay out of politics and these sensitive issues as much as it can? Although Pope Francis hasn't been shy about occasionally commenting on the Middle East.
That's it, Chris, exactly. So, we've never had a creche with such a strong political controversy as this in recent times. But yes, Francis is so different to his predecessor, Pope Benedict. He's waded into international politics far more than Pope Benedict did, and he's not treading as carefully as some would expect the spiritual leader of 1.4 billion Catholics to tread. He's not treading carefully, really. And let's take, for instance, his recent outspokenness on Gaza specifically, and his increasing criticism of Israel's military campaign. Chris, last month, Francis was under fire for using the term genocide linked to Gaza. In essence, here's that story in excerpts from a book containing interviews with Francis that were published in November. Francis referred to the war in Gaza as possible genocide. He said he was calling for an investigation by the global community to ascertain whether the actions of Israel can be classified as a genocide, and whether Israel's campaign against Hamas fits into the technical definition of genocide. So, Chris, this is a very delicate situation with what some might term a not always really delicate in his expressions Pope. Let's also underline here that the Pope has welcomed the families of Israeli hostages. He has repeatedly called for the immediate release of the hostages. And if you want, it's interesting to compare this situation to his lack of outspoken criticism against Russia in the aftermath of the Ukraine invasion. That's a whole other kettle of fish. But some would have said that he was holding back because he was really hoping that the Vatican and Vatican diplomats would perhaps be called on to broker a peace there. Now, that doesn't look highly likely, but that might be one of the explanations, Chris.
Well, and just finally to this political point or diplomacy point, Pope Francis has also been meeting on Thursday with the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. What do we imagine was discussed there?
Well, here's the thing. Meetings between Francis and leaders remain private. They're what exactly is discussed isn't made public. It was a 30-minute meeting. However, Abu Mazen also met the equivalent of the Prime Minister of the Vatican, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, and the equivalent of the Foreign Minister, which would be Archbishop Paul Gallagher. And so the Vatican has put out 4 points that were discussed. They discussed the humanitarian situation in Gaza, hopes for a ceasefire, and the release of hostages as soon as possible. They also discussed the church's contribution to Palestinian society. Let's remember that there is a parish in Gaza City doing a lot of relief work there, and the Pope says that he talks daily to the parish priest there on the ground. Abbas's meetings also are said to have focused on the need to implement a two-state solution, not with violence, but via diplomacy and dialogue, and the importance of a special status for Jerusalem, of course, given its importance for the 3 key monotheistic religions. And then the last topic of discussion, Chris, 2025 is just around the corner. For Catholics, this is a Jubilee year or a holy year. These holy years come up every 25 years. And Rome is in great preparation for the influx of thousands of pilgrims that are becoming, and the two sides discussed the hope that pilgrims would also be able to return for the Jubilee year to the Holy Land. Of course, since the October 7th attacks, tourism has completely dried up there, and equally pilgrims have not been able to make their trips there either.
Very interesting. We'll see how that develops in 2025. Juliet Lindley, thank you very much for joining us from Zurich. Still to come in the program, we discuss the Czech film Waves with its producer and director.
Bojujeme za svobodu slova. Jako vy.
This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
You are back with The Globalist. I'm Chris Cermak, and let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Charles Hecker, political risk analyst and author of the brand new book, Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia. Good morning, Charles.
Chris, good morning.
Great to have you here. Great to have a little discussion with you on a Friday. There's a story we're not going to discuss, but we're going to start with not discussing, which is Time Person of the Year, Donald Trump. We don't really need to discuss that, do we?
I suppose we're just going to skate straight over that. Lots of other people will be talking about that, and we've been talking about this particular individual forever, it seems.
And we will continue to talk about him forever, because there will be another 4 years at least. To dissect how much of a person of the year and years he has been.
That's right. He's going to be the person of the next 4 years. He's going to be the person of the day, every day, for the next 4 years, 365 days of them. So Time does this every year. They have put artists, they have put scientists, they have put all kinds of worthy individuals on the cover. Usually these are people who are significant newsmakers over the course of the previous year. And, the winner of the November 6th elections was, a bit of a bombshell. So, the bomb landed on the front cover of Time magazine.
It's always interesting, I have to say, when they do this, because in a way, like they kind of, with this idea of making it the biggest newsmaker of the year, it really doesn't become a surprise anymore, does it? Unlike, Nobel Peace Prize or certain things where there's a certain amount of anticipation about it. But if you're just making it the most talked about person,
that's right.
Obviously it's Trump.
they haven't done a hugely creative choice. They haven't done a hugely inspiring choice. With end of the year sorts of top 10 lists and top 5 lists, whether it's books or restaurants or people or anything like that, most of them are fairly predictable.
So that was us not talking about Time Person of the Year. Let's move on to a few other things. Charles, the price of coffee is about to skyrocket because of weather?
That's right, Chris. This is a very important story, especially at this time of the morning. So if you're enjoying a strong coffee right now, whether you're in a cafe or you're at your kitchen table, you are going forward going to start to pay an awful lot more for this coffee. And so we're looking at the Times, which tells us that in 2 of the world's major coffee-producing countries, that's Brazil and perhaps slightly surprisingly, Vietnam, both dry spells and wet spells have spoiled the coffee crop. And the most interesting thing really is that for people who enjoy Arabica beans, my personal favorite, by the way, the price of Arabica beans right now is at a 50-year high. And just in the past year, the price of Arabica has gone up by 18%. The alternate coffee, Robusta, which is traditionally a little bit cheaper than Arabica beans, is also still sky high.
Still sky high. Something tells me it's still not going to stop people from drinking coffee, that whether this becomes a luxury item or whatever one might want to classify it as, we need our coffee.
Here's the problem. If you can believe it, I mean, the last time the Times looked seriously at coffee prices was 2019, when everything was really different because, of course, it was before the pandemic, when we had a massive spike, after which we had a massive spike in inflation and everything became more expensive. But a cappuccino at Pret-a-Manger, which is, one of these sort of litmus tests for high street prices, in 2019, a cappuccino at Pret-a-Manger would set you back £2.45. Today, unless you have one of those super Pret subscriptions, you will have to pay £4 5p, and that is a 65% increase.
Well, that is, I suppose, the question, isn't it? We're going to go back to like filter coffee instead of our fancy cappuccinos and other things, but we're still going to need coffee in some way, shape, or form for this time of the morning.
Well, even the watery stuff, the Americano, which is a sort of minor slight against my country. The watery Americano is now also £3.60, which is 50% more expensive than it was over the course of the past 5 years. And for anybody who thinks, okay, well, that's fine, I'm going to switch to instant coffee, heaven help us, or I'm going to start making coffee at home, all of that is a lot more expensive too.
Now, there is some actual political news as well, although I do feel like the coffee crisis is the main news of the day. But nonetheless, we do also have here in Europe, Romania and Bulgaria joining the EU's Schengen free movement after Austria, one of my countries, dropped its own opposition.
That's right. We're looking at a story in the FT that says now the Schengen area, which allows people to cross borders without showing any sort of identification and without any sort of visas, there will now be 29 members starting January 1st. And the latest two members are Romania and Bulgaria. And you're right to point out that these two countries joined the Schengen visa-free zone over and after the objection of Austria, which kept on saying that they were worried about open borders sort of causing problems with corruption, causing problems with irregular migration. Vienna finally caved, or rather changed its point of view on the topic. And that
possibly because the far right did not get into government in Austria. That would be one way of looking at this, but that's a whole other segment.
Well, it's interesting to say, though, because you're absolutely right to say that across the Schengen zone and, of course, across the border EU, right-wing resistance to freer movement of people, and we might get to that in a second, but resistance to freer movement of people is a real hot button issue. And so opening the borders even further for the populist movement was a difficult issue to accept. And even sort of Germany, France, and the Netherlands have recently kind of reimposed a certain degree of border controls when crossing into those countries. But for the time being, Bulgaria and Romania now have much greater freedom of movement. This was a major political victory for the leading parties in those two countries who had been promising freedom of movement for years.
Absolutely promising for years, and it'll be interesting to see how that develops in 2025 when they actually join and the EU's borders are extended. But Charles, I actually wanted to go on to one other story that you had moving away from Europe and going to Japan, because you have a story about Japan tightening cannabis laws amid rising youth usage.
That's right. So this is another law that's going to change with the start of the new year. And apparently there had been a fairly gaping loophole in Japanese cannabis law, and that is it was illegal to possess and it was illegal to sell, but the actual usage of cannabis in Japan was not illegal. It was perfectly fine. And that loophole ultimately got too big for Japanese law enforcement and for regulatory authorities. And so now possession, transfer, and usage of marijuana in Japan carries a potential prison sentence of up to 7 years. So a fairly serious crackdown on usage. There are some exceptions, and that includes medical purposes, as long as the drug is prescriptioned and licensed. The problem, though, as you point to, is that usage of marijuana in Japan is at a record high.
As it is in many places, frankly, at this point.
Well, pardon the pun. When it comes to record, I just realized that, as at a record high.
Pun not intended, intended.
Completely accidental, but on point. And here's the thing, and that is that there were close to 7,000 cases of marijuana-related offenses in Japan in 2023. And young people, anybody under 30 in Japan is considered young, it was 72.9% of all of those cases. So Japan senses that it's got a sort of youth abuse issue when it comes to the usage of marijuana and hence the crackdown. The Japan Times, which features the story, reminds us, though, that Japan is very much running counter to international trends in this new crackdown, and that is that almost everywhere else, particularly in the developed world and in advanced economies, marijuana regulations are loosening, and across the United States and across Europe, more and more countries are legalizing personal usage of cannabis and cannabis products.
And a key reason for that, especially I know in our respective country of the U.S., was also because of the amount of people who were put in prison simply for usage. I mean, do we really imagine the Japanese are now suddenly going to put everyone in jail for 7 years if they've used cannabis?
Could you imagine what happens if of all of these 6,700 cases of abuse of marijuana usage laws were actually sent to prison for up to 7 years? Japanese prisons would probably burst at the seams. And that's the thing, is that sort of the war on drugs, as you point to in the United States, turned into a war on the prison system where most states were unable to house and didn't have the capacity to hold all of the people that were accused of breaking all of these drug laws.
Charles Hecker, thank you very much for joining us here on The Globalist. You are back with The Globalist, and it's time now for our wacky weekly look at the news. Andrew Muller is here with what we learned.
So long, farewell, our readers saying good night.
We learned this week, and not for the first time in human history, that when it goes wrong for tyrants, it goes wrong pretty suddenly.
We begin with breaking news out of Syria, of course. Opposition forces have declared the end of President Bashar al-Assad's rule after 13 years of civil war. Well, earlier, Reuters News reported that the leader, who ruled for 24 years, had actually left the capital, Damascus.
We learned, as we often do at such moments, that both the depravity and the self-indulgence of the deposed dictator are of a scale barely imagined by even his most determined critics. And we learned, or were reminded, that there are few spectacles as heartening as those who believed themselves damned, suddenly liberated from their dungeons, or those long oppressed, making themselves comfortable on the unloaded despot's invariably hideous sofas. And we learned what former President Bashar al-Assad had been buying with his clearly very carefully saved Syrian public sector wages.
This is a man who had expensive tastes. We've seen Aston Martins, we've got Lamborghinis, we've got Ferraris.
We learned that Assad had decided to contemplate his retirement options from a distance, having astutely timed his moment to bolt for the airport with as much of the national treasury as he could stuff into his portmanteaus.
Russian state media say President Bashar al-Assad has been granted asylum in Moscow after fleeing his country.
We have not learned for certain, but are choosing, what with one thing and another, to assume that Assad has asked for a room on the ground floor and will be steering clear of chartered aviation. We have not, as of this recording, learned quite who is going to be running Syria next, though if we're honest, and at the very real risk of throwing something of a damp towel on the fireworks, we learned via a brisk riffle through the CVs of certain of the contenders of perhaps one or two causes for concern.
Who is Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, a nom de guerre adopted from his jihadist past, now seen by many as a hero after a lightning-quick revolt that chased Bashar al-Assad out of Syria? Al-Jolani leads Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, a breakaway from al-Qaeda.
We learned that Mr. al-Ghwell and indeed HTS were at pains to stress that their thinking on certain subjects had evolved somewhat.
They've also been accused of human rights abuses in areas they control, including executions and persecution of religious minorities and women. Although more recently, they claim to have disavowed terrorism and are trying to present a more moderate face.
But we have learned from observations of politics generally that between what someone says before they reach office and what they actually do once installed in it lies a considerable gap, and we have therefore learned many times before this week to manage expectations somewhat. But we hope to learn imminently of better days for our Syrian listeners. We'll be needing at this point a sound effect of a lengthy run-up evocative of a gymnast hurtling towards a vault with a view to executing an especially audacious manoeuvre. Because... Sticking with the subject of men with beards seducing anxiously optimistic punters with promises of a good time... We learned that parents in Hampshire had been disappointed by Santa Claus.
Oh my goodness! That was spectacular!
Landing stuck. Yes, we learned that it was indeed the happiest time of year, i.e. that time of year in which parents are photographed folding their arms and affecting grumpy expressions outside Christmas attractions which have failed to impress their ghastly chocolate-smeared children. We learned that in the English settlement of Winchester, teeth were being gnashed at a Winter Wonderland-style attraction with particular reference to a suboptimal Santa Claus. We learned that among the grievances enumerated by customers was the following, as will now be solemnly intoned by Monocle's Festive Disappointments desk chief, Fernando Augusto Pacheco.
This was just a guy dressed up in a cheap red suit with a blatantly false beard.
We have not as yet learned what the denizens of Winchester think Santa Claus actually usually is, but we confess ourselves absolutely agog to find out. Email address is on the website if there isn't too much of a queue for Winchester's computer. And we learned that Christmas has come early for Greece. Not that one. For this is more of a tale of the one that I don't want. We learned that the incoming circus of US President-elect Donald Trump intends to dispatch as its ambassador to Athens...
Ladies and gentlemen, leaders and fighters for freedom and liberty and the American dream, the best is yet to come.
Kimberly Guilfoyle, former Fox News presenter, whose arrival may prove something of a boon to Greek earplug retailers. We learned after exhaling the necessary weary leaden sigh, which has become such a necessary preamble to researching the background of any appointee of the second Trump administration, that this nomination appears to be both a consolation prize to Guilfoyle and a gift to second worst Donald Trump Jr.
Ooh, I can't wait to see where this goes.
Okay.
Tell me more.
Let's see where this goes.
You asked for it. We learned that, sad to relate, and frankly even sadder to reflect that we are reading about this for a living, that Guilfoyle appears no longer to be Junior's +1 and has been supplanted in his affections by... someone else who we frankly refuse to learn anything about, as you have to draw a line somewhere. Still, we learned when we delved further into Guilfoyle's CV that she is abundantly qualified for her new role. Not in having any experience of diplomacy or demonstrable expertise in the affairs of the Eastern Mediterranean, good Lord no, this is a Trump administration, but in having been on television, having been willing to endorse Trump's fantasies of having won the 2020 presidential election, and having had to leave at least one previous job beneath the shadow of an out-of-court settlement of a human resources complaint. Still, not the first time an otherwise unemployable celebrity has been punted off to star in Greece. Am I right? You can fade the song back up now to underpin this extremely clever pun. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
Andrew, thank you very much for that. You're with Monocle Radio. You are back with The Globalist. I'm Chris Cermak. When the Nakagin Capsule Tower first was completed in 1972, the revolutionary design by the architect Kisho Kurokawa was meant to herald a new way of living. Its 140 living pods were designed to be replaced every 25 years. Sadly, that vision never quite came to fruition. NCT fell into disrepair, was dismantled in 2023. Campaigns have since been launched to keep the tower and its capsules preserved. And this week, the hotel brand Accor released a rendering for the Pullman Tokyo Ginza Hotel that will stand in its place. Well, to tell us more about all of this, I'm joined by Monocle's Asia editor Fiona Wilson, fresh off a plane from Tokyo to London. Good morning, Fiona.
Hi, Chris. Very happy to be here in person.
It is great to have you back here in London. So tell us about this structure that you left behind in Tokyo. What does it mean to the city?
I mean, we have to put it in the past tense. It was just such an epic building. It was actually 2 concrete towers and 140 prefabricated capsules. They're about sort of 2 by 4.5 meters were bolted to these 2 concrete towers. And it was an incredible landmark. I mean, I think if you know Tokyo, it was one of the modernist landmarks. And actually, it was a movement called metabolism. And Kisho Kurokawa was one of the early proponents of this movement. The idea was Tokyo's growing. How do we accommodate this burgeoning urban population? And his idea was, let's have these pods that people could live in, and then they bolt them onto a structure. When they move, they take the pod with them. So if you ever went to this tower, I did. I went to visit these amazing pods. They were all self-contained. So they built everything in it, the bathroom, even a little kind of audio unit. It was so fantastically 1970s. And the window was this rather adorable sort of curved porthole, and you looked out onto the city. And it was a wonderful monument. I was so upset when it was demolished. And I didn't really rejoice in the news that it's going to be turned into a luxury hotel, that site.
Well, to that question then, I mean, do we have any sense of what kind of luxury hotel is going to come in its place? And particularly this question of whether they will pay homage to the architect and the original design.
Well, yes, there is a drawing showing what it will look like. And I have to say, I don't see any signs of Kisho Kurokawa's amazing design. It was very unique, that structure. I don't know, maybe they're going to pay some homage inside, put photographs up or something. Nothing will ever replace the building. What's happened to the capsules is that they're turning up in museums. They sold some of them. Many were in a great state of disrepair. There was a big campaign to save it. I mean, I'm often talking about architecture in Tokyo disappearing, and this vintage of architecture, 60s, 70s, very vulnerable to demolition. And there was a big campaign to save it. Didn't work. But a lot of museums around the world thought, well, we'd like a capsule. So they're turning up in museums. Hong Kong, there'll be one in the States. And, it's a bit sad for me. I think it really was wonderful if it had survived as a complete building. And really, I recommend anyone go and have a look at that Nakagin Capsule Tower, because it's a remarkable, rather unique building, and also one of the few relics of that metabolist movement. But if you still are interested in the movement, I would say there's another building quite close, the Shizuoka Press and Broadcasting Centre by Kenzo Tange, which is another personal favourite of mine from 1967. Go and look at that and you can still see what metabolism was.
And just finally, Fiona, any sense of whether the capsules, this idea of a capsule, will that remain at all? Does any of that concept still remain alive?
I mean, being realistic, it never worked, and it was never replicated. Nobody ever really moved those capsules. They bolted them on, and that's where they stayed. The idea was that it would be this incredible movement, sort of like an organism. The city could grow and shrink as people moved in and out. Never happened, but what a wonderful idea.
Fiona Wilson, thank you very much for joining us. That was Monocle's Fiona Wilson. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
You are back with The Globalists, and it's time now for trade and economy news. We're going to focus on Europe for today, which has seen some success recently in pushing down inflation, but instead has seen its economic growth come to a virtual halt in the process. Well, joining me for more on this and other economy news is Vicky Price, economist and former joint head of the UK government's economic service. Vicky, always good to have you on the show. And the reason that we're focusing on Europe today is because the European Central Bank just cut interest rates on Thursday by 0.25 percentage point. It is a bid to kind of once again boost growth without prices rising. Tell us about what they did and why.
Indeed. Well, they did cut by 25 basis points. There had been an expectation maybe a few weeks ago that they could have gone for something bigger, maybe 50 basis points, but they didn't. And I think that makes sense for the moment. But I think the markets have read what was in the press release that came out and listened to Lagarde in her press statement afterwards. And I think they have generally assumed that there will be more cuts ahead, and maybe at some point there will be a 50 basis points cut, because the growth issue, as you suggested, is a very important one. We've seen quite a slowdown in some major economies. I mean, Germany itself, of course, probably in recession for the year as a whole of 2024. A little bit of growth next year is forecast, but they have downgraded their overall forecast for the Eurozone and the EU. So if you look at that, then you can see that the worries are more to do with what's going to happen to activity in the Eurozone economy and wider. And with inflation under control, they feel that they can probably carry on cutting.
Well, that is always the question, isn't it, Vicky? Because there is a balance for a central bank in terms of when you stop worrying about rising prices and start worrying about growth. Does it seem like to you that central banks really feel like the inflation that we had seen of the past few years is under control, or could that come back again?
They did stress that there is a sort of double-sided risk profile that's there. It could go either way, because, of course, there's the geopolitics, which could move negatively. So energy prices will be going up. Instead, they can be going down if the world economy slows down itself. So there are some issues there. They're concerned about, inevitably, like all the rest of us, about Trump's tariffs. They don't know, in fact, and when Lagarde was asked at the press conference, she did say that in the short term, that if there are indeed those tariffs that Trump is suggesting, inflation could go up. But overall, if you have barriers to trade, then the economies generally slow down. So it could move the other way as well. So pretty balanced in terms of where the risks lie. But there is no doubt that they're more relaxed on the inflation front, because they made it very clear that the monetary sort of restriction phrase that was generally there, that interest rates had to be restrictive because that was a need of the current situation, that seems to be slowly disappearing. So I think the general consensus is that they think that inflation is going to be under control. And if you look at some of their forecasts, it barely moves up or sort of above 2%, frankly. And if you look 2 years ahead, it's below 2% anyway. So I think they probably feel that they have sorted that and they're in control. And do remember that the Europeans have generally worried more about deflation at various stages. They have had deflation, of course, in the mid-2010s, and that has been a serious problem for them. And the last time, in fact, that they went into serious recession was the time when Jean-Claude Trichet, when he was head of the European Central Bank, raised rates in 2011 twice, and actually then discovered that the Eurozone was already in recession at the time. So they are cautious about that. I think they're worried more about deflationary issues, I'm suggesting, than about inflation resurging.
Well, and Vicky, one other aspect of this, I mean, you did touch on the fact that they're also working against maybe headwinds from governments, things like tariffs that might be introduced by Donald Trump and other things like that. I mean, how much can a central bank, therefore, actually do about growth and helping Europe grow further? Are they hoping that governments will step in and do some of the right things as well?
I think they probably are hoping. The interesting thing is that you've seen a little bit of an improvement in terms of loan availability for firms. So that should help growth over a period. And clearly lower interest rates and lower inflation should also be positive. But of course, they have absolutely no say on what happens on the fiscal front. And we know that there are serious difficulties, whether you look at France or whether you look at Germany or some of the other countries as well, where the appetite is not for expansion, but in fact, if anything, the fiscal side should be contracting. And that, of course, counts against anything perhaps the central bank will do. So where we'll end up with growth is questionable. And if you look, of course, at what happens in other countries, there's another concern that the ECB will have, Europe more generally, the Eurozone in particular, which is the exchange rate. Obviously, if interest rates in other countries, particularly in the US, we're going to hear about that next week, and in the UK come down, but come down more slowly, or at least the level between the European rates and the Eurozone rates and the other countries widens, then we can see, of course, the euro itself weakening, and that counts against, or will work against inflation in itself, in other words, lowering inflation. So there will be more of a difficulty to reduce inflation if the euro is also weak. And I think they will be looking at that very carefully too.
Vicky, thank you very much for joining us. That was Vicky Price, The Economist. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Globalist, and finally, there is one film from the Czech Republic hoping to make a mark at next year's Oscars. Waves tells the story of the 1968 Prague Spring and subsequent Soviet invasion from the perspective of a team of radio journalists fighting to keep their broadcast on air even as enemy troops move in. It's become the title of the year in the Czech Republic, surpassing Barbie with the number of cinema admissions and stunning audiences with its pacey soundtrack and thriller storyline. Monocle's Julia Lasica spoke to the director, Jiří Madi, and producer, Monika Kristl, to find out more about the Czech nomination for Best International Film Feature at the 2025 Academy Awards.
This film, it's about 1968 Prague Spring and then the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, something lots of people have learnt about in their history lessons. But what is so exciting about it is that it's told from the perspective of radio journalists working at the Czechoslovak radio. And it's a very dynamic, fast, pacey film. So if we just start generally with the inspiration behind making the film, why did you want to focus on radio journalists? Why do you think journalists tell this story so well?
Okay, I read a little chapter in a huge book about Czechoslovakian radio, and once I read the 17 pages, I already understood that it's a dynamic story. It looked like a synopsis of a film itself. And then I simply digged in and I found out that there's a gap on the timeline of what I know. And people usually know that there were the troops who came, cut off the building, and that there wasn't a single bulb in the radio building that would be on. There was nothing really working. And then everybody knows that they maintained broadcast for another 6 days. But the question is, how come? How did they manage to do it? And this is something I was ready to find out. And the way the story evolved in front of my eyes was amazing.
And obviously it's history, but it has such a youthful feel. And you were both talking previously to me about how a lot of the audience who are coming to see your film now in Czechia and in Slovakia are people, very young people who are sort of in their late teens, early 20s. And so many of the film's protagonists are so young as well. They're students. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me, was that a very conscious decision to have young people sort of as the focus, the audience focus, and the focus of the film itself, to give it that youthful feel?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was on purpose, but it was not that way in the beginning, because we had this student storyline in it, but we somehow needed to make it bigger, and also to start with it, because that's really a very nice fade in, because no matter if you're at that age, you probably have been at that age, so it's easy to identify with, and to identify with the defiance that the students have. And they were always the trigger for huge historical events or for the turnovers. So yeah, we did it on purpose, but not only like purpose because it works, but because that's the way it was.
Yeah. And can you tell me also about specific things that you did to the film, the format of the film itself and the visuals of the film itself? The music I'm thinking of as well, which is so striking, that made it feel so much more dynamic and youthful.
It's interesting because we knew we wanted this to look modern and sound modern. So we used little tricks. Like if you look at the fashion of that time, of that decade, so some of the pieces look silly, and some people mock it, but they're very good outfits as well, and you can still wear it. Actually, we do wear it, and the same is with music. Like some of the music couldn't make it today, and some of the music is still pretty big deal, and so we only went for those that work today. And the same was like, I know that there were a lot of people smoking in the offices at that time, but whenever I see a movie and people smoke in offices or in the aircraft or whatever, so you instantly understand that it's the past. So in our movie, in the scenes where we're in the radio, so you can see the ashtrays on the tables, but people never smoke, because when they would, you start to perceive it as a period piece.
That's really cool. And there's so many joyful moments as well that are so universal, like when the students rip up the pillows and then all the feathers are sort of exploding all over the screen, and they're dancing to this incredible, I think, 60s music, right. Music that would have been banned in Czechia at the time. And yeah, the feathers are sort of all floating around. So there is a sense of timelessness, I guess.
Yeah, that's what we wanted. We wanted to keep timeless pieces of fashion, timeless pieces of music. So some of the songs from that era already disappeared from the radio stations and from our Spotify lists. But some of the songs and really beautiful songs from that time are still on, and that's what we wanted to show in the movie. That our life goes from the past through today for the future, and the journey is important to us, but also to look for the past, but also to look for the future.
So the archive footage, I loved the way that was used to set the mood, the tone of Prague at that time, and also to mix in the protagonists, the actors of your film, with real people, from what I understand. Can you tell me about that process, the decisions you made? Where did the archive footage come from? How did you find it?
We had different sources for the footage. Luckily, we found also some of the materials which were never used before. And Yuri and our team went through all the materials and back and forwards to find the right shots which would fit to the story. And as our cameraman says, limitation creates style. So I think that was it. I refused to bring tanks in the center of Prague. We have only one with the rubbers, which is able to drive on asphalt. But anyway, we would not be able to create such atmosphere. And then Yuri took it in his hands and followed his instincts with rewriting specific scenes in the script, which we could not find, and the other way around.
Yeah, like first there was the screenplay, and then there came the archives as a tool, as a new tool that really is part of the DNA of the film. But at the same time, I rewrote certain scenes, but only in a way that, I don't know, you have turmoil of people with extras that we would never be able to pay. And then you have, in the screenplay, there was a tank explosion, but able to pay an tank explosion in the middle of the Prague, and I couldn't find it in the archive. So I said, okay, there's a fire, but I see a tank burning. So we can use that, because that's also a danger. It's a fire and people around it. And the only thing I needed to do is to find the insert shots in it, meaning you need to confuse the viewers so that you see the archive, but at the same time you make a close-up to people around it, and that makes it a film.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you so much. It's been so fascinating to hear about this. And we wish you the very best of luck, because, of course, this film is the Czech Republic's entry to next year's Oscars. So, yes, good luck. Thank you.
That was Julia Lasica in conversation with Yuri Madi and Monica Christel. That's all the time we have for today's program. Thanks very much to our producers, Hassan Anderson and Tom Webb, our researcher, Maisie Ringer, and our studio manager, Lily Austin, with editing assistance from Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there is more music on the way. The Briefing is live at midday in London. The Globalist returns at the same time on Monday. I'm Chris Cermak. Thank you for tuning in.